The next guy, when I think of this guy's name, Bob Odette, I can't help but smile. And I think at the end of this 20-minute segment, you're going to smile with him. I think his presentation, in my mind, is 50% entertainment, 50% facts that you didn't know.
Thank you, Don, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. And I have to say, George Kurz, I've known him for over 40 years and hadn't thought about it that long ago that he was working for me. And I'll have to admit, I always say that I had a full head of hair when he came to work for me, but I really didn't, so I can't blame you for that, George. Good to be here. All right, let's get going here. A few pictures that may be familiar to you.
Oh, America! Are you serious? It is showtime, baby! Here we go! Ram, jam, slam, bam! It's awesome, baby! Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble! Y'all ready for this? Welcome to the big show.
All right, we're going to talk about collection system metrics primarily and how we operate at the state of Tennessee, some of our regulatory requirements. And ideally, I guess all regulators, maybe engineers, nerd engineers, we like those metrics to come up with some. And George Kurz has really come up with something that we are using extensively. We plan to use it probably across the state with all of it. We're using it across the state now with all of our enforcement actions. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But for background, just give you a quick peek at the requirements that are in our NPDES permits. These are pretty common across the country. We're a delegated state. A discharge or a discharge of a pollutant, simply the addition of a pollutant to waters from any source. And sanitary sewer overflows, an unpermitted discharge, and these are discharges, they are prohibited both by the Clean Water Act and our permit. Now, the other thing that we have, you don't necessarily have to have a direct connection with the water. Something comes out of the sewer, it may end up in somebody's backyard, disappear in the ground, whatever. We're calling those releases. But for us, the health of a collection system, the overflows and releases, we're treating those the same because it's water, wastewater coming out of the sewer line, and that's not good, obviously. So how does someone get on to a moratorium where they have a serious enough condition where we're saying you can't add any more collection lines or anything to your system unless you show us some reduction in your INI? Well, right now in the permit, if you have more than 5 SSO'S and releases at any location, bingo, that triggers you into being on a moratorium, a self-imposed moratorium. Along with that, if you have effluent violations that can be directly related to excessive INI, that's going to do it also. And usually you have both conditions when somebody gets hit with a moratorium. So the question then becomes for all of us, what's fair? How do we measure success? We don't want to be, overly restrictive, but we've got to have some measurement to see how well those systems are actually responding and be able to prove it. So when I started off looking at all this statewide data, I said, this is going to be pretty easy because we've got all this data. We can look at the percent INI. We know who right now is on a moratorium. We know the number of SSO'S and releases. We've got a great correlating metrics here of being able to see how these things completely line up. Well, guess what? It was all over the board. It was like a shotgun effect. There wasn't any correlation. There wasn't any linear relationship to this. And I said, well, why not? Try to find out why there was a problem. So what I've done over the last 2 or 3 years, I've looked at the complete picture in our state. The universe is 244 systems that report, that have NPDES permits. There's another about 40 systems that are under a state operating permit that also have collection systems, but the primary thing that we have the data on is the 244. So if you look at 244, 174 of those have more than 50% INI, 57 have greater than 70, but there are 43 on an active moratorium. So for my thinking, at least the ones that had over 70%, you would think that they would be on there, but they're not. And part of the reason why, if you go out here and you take a look, out of 244, I'll ask you this question. In a whole year, if somebody had one release, one overflow, or one bypass, all they had to do was have one of any of those to get on the list, how many out of 244 do you think would be on that list? 244. Exactly right. Well, that's what I thought, but whoops, that's not the case. Only 154. Where's the other 90 or so in there? And then you start looking at the data, and remember that trigger of more than 5 gets you onto a self-imposed moratorium? Of all those who are reporting, the median value is 5. So my conclusion is that all of this data, or most of the data, is bogus. Now, there are 1 or 2 systems that are reporting like 300 and 400 overflows. They're the honest, they are being honest, they're counting all of them. But so many are not for that very reason. Same way like George is talking about the stuff that's sent in on NPDES permit applications. These guys filling this application out is either the engineer or maybe the operator. He's not the collection system guy. They're always underestimating when it comes to INI. Oh, that's INI is not really that big of a problem, because they know the potential ramifications. If they raise their head too much, somebody may come in on them and say, well, you ought to have be under a moratorium, or maybe we ought to come out and do a close inspection a day or 2 after you have your next big rain event and see how well you're doing. And by the way, we're starting to do that too, and the results are not very encouraging. So the old adage, you know, if a tree falls in the woods, is there actually going to be noise there? And that's what I think a lot of these collection system people are doing. They're thinking, well, you know, if I don't go out there, I'm not lying. If I don't go out to those problem areas after a rainfall event, if I don't see it, you know, I'm not. And some people have actually admitted that. And to me, it's obvious from the data that's being reported that we are grossly under knowing what the actual numbers are. And moratoriums, I don't know what familiarity you have with them, but in Tennessee, this is a big deal. I mean, we're in senators' offices and politicians, the governor's being called a lot of these times. The commissioner, we're constantly in the commissioner's office battling with people because we're the big bad regulators. We're bringing the hammer down. We're stopping growth in the economy of Tennessee because, you know, we won't let people on moratoriums. But what the problem is they won't fix their problems. We're trying to protect the environment. We're trying to protect people's health and well-being and property values. So again, I'm probably preaching to the choir on some of this stuff. So as George mentioned, we are using, and he's been great at this, looking at the MOR data that they submit. We're not, this isn't our data. This isn't stuff our field office people have gone out and rounded up. We're using the own data that they submit on MORs. And as George mentioned, you know, this monthly operational report's got a lot of data on it, but we're primarily focusing, and George's method here is, you know, the rainfall, the inflow and flow, BOD, those are reported on these MORs. And again, I take my hat off to him. I think 170,000 data points or 200,000 data points. I mean, that's been instrumental in helping us get a picture of what's really going on in the state. And that's a lot of work, because this was more the old days when these were paper copies, PDF files. They weren't EMORs like we're trying to get everybody to now. If we had everybody do EMORs, and some of those are starting to come in, and George is using them, zippity-doo-dah if it's all electronic, but otherwise it takes a lot of time and effort to do it. So talk about somebody who's passionate about what they do. That's George. Thank goodness we've got George. So as George has showed you, this is a typical graph then that can be generated. We can learn a lot about the system just looking at that, and also project in a little bit further into this with a model of what the collection system is actually doing. Can we actually develop a model for the collection system, like a Streeter Phelps or a Qual 2E you'd have for a stream? I think this is what we are able to do. Einstein said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I definitely think what the twist that George has put on this regression analysis is a model that's definitely useful. There's some areas that he knows better than anybody, but it's not always correct. Sometimes you get some weird things that you have to look at, and sometimes the data is just not there. They've either got poor rain gauges or they got faulty flow meters. So if the base information that they're supplying you is no good, then certainly the model is going to be no good. So when it comes to these moratorium metrics, this regression model using the MOR data is what we're about. We're using this in enforcement action or release from enforcement action. And I know George doesn't like titles, but our former chief engineer was going to call this the Kersian regression model. And we've agreed that we're not going to, we'll give him credit for it, but he doesn't like it, and I guess it's probably better that we don't use it. So I'll stop using it on my slides. But he's done many papers. We give these as references to people that are under moratoriums. Hopefully some people are starting to use George, but it doesn't have to be George necessarily to do it. We can do it ourselves, or they can do it and make their case. So basically, as George had pointed out, the effects of this rainfall-derived INI and long-term dry weather infiltration, that's what we're looking at. It's kind of unestimated by this linear regression, and the INI quantity compared to the rainfall depth for a discrete event. And what I would point out to you, I guess, again, I've said a model, that's what I'm calling it. Maybe someone would disagree with me. But the improvement on this, the regression line, what we're looking at in Tennessee, the 2-year 24-hour storm, say Middle Tennessee, it's about 3.4 inches. So we're wanting to see, when the regression line is plotted, the model for that system, where does that line cross the remaining capacity at the treatment plant? And in this case, that's a good result, because it's below the 2-year 24-hour storm is well below where the capacity of the remaining capacity of the treatment plant is. Now, I've just superimposed another line in there, but typically what we would see with a system that's in bad shape under a moratorium would be that where that red line is. And what we're trying to get people to do is come to where that other line is. And that's the amount, simplistically, the amount of INI reduction that they have. We've got to see that regression line move to the left, along with other data that we can look at to verify that, yes, indeed, you have removed INI. So many times we've talked about these basins, and we've got people doing CMOMs and whatnot, but many times we've seen them go about all this rehab work in certain areas, manholes, and then 3 or 4 years later, they spent all this money, done really good work in these areas, but the overall reduction, you don't see anything. What happened? How is that possible? Well, what's happened is they've corrected the overflows and releases up gradient, but then all that water is still coming into the system. It's just going down gradient, and it hasn't been removed. So that's not always the case, but that has been the case when people go about their correction programs without good monitoring, without a good plan at the beginning. And to kind of wrap up, again, preaching to the choir here, we don't have to fool around that this is a very expensive proposition, but many of these cities and engineers don't really want to admit the cost of I&I, because I think engineers primarily, and I'm one and I can say this, they would rather build a big pipe, build a big expansion to a treatment plant than get back up in the system and get rid of that I&I. I mean, they can't get rid of all of it, but you can get so much of it removed. They're missing the boat on how much it costs. Well, George puts in his spreadsheet a reminder to everybody. He uses a measly $1.80 per 1,000 gallons. My take is, if you look at EPA data, you all may have some data, that this is not 180, it's more like $3 to $5 per 1,000 gallons for treatment. But at $1.80 in Tennessee, $200 million is down the drain. That what could we do, utilities across the state, with $200 million, 244 systems, that's almost $1 million a system on the average. I mean, you can do quite a bit of work with that. So the take-home points here, fairly easy, that we need definitely to develop and utilize a technology sound collection system metric. We've got one. I haven't seen any better. There's other things that we can use, but the regression analysis that George has worked on and presented, that's top drawer for us. That's our number one metric. And again, no surprises. If you don't reduce the I&I, all right.
That's all, folks.
All right, Don, how'd I do here? All right. Well, I had to give George a little cushion there, right? All right. Yeah, the question is, are we still kind of where we are 40 years ago? Are we moving towards what, say, Naperville has done? No, we're not anywhere near what Naperville doing, but we're moving in a direction. We're a lot better off than we were 40 years ago. We're a lot better off, I can tell you, just than we were 2 or 3 years ago in the state of Tennessee. And the primary emphasis is we finally got compliance and enforcement people and our director and deputy director finally believing and recognizing the value of the metrics that we've got and also understanding the problems that are out there. So when we're writing orders now, I've just worked on one for a small town here in Middle Tennessee. It's really a trailblazing, brand new order that's got a lot of these things in there, not maybe all the 10 steps of George, but rather than just going through the old CMOM checklist or send this in and here's your report and here's your annual report and we're checking this off, you did this. And nobody's looking at it. It's not, most of those things aren't worth the paper they're written on. But that trend is changing. So I may not see it in my career, but I'm going to leave probably the state in another year or two, and I think we're going to be well on the road to having that happen. I mean, these permit cycles, our permit writer, a manager of permits, he's putting this requirement for a flow monitoring device that we approve, not some stuff that you can't trust. Rain gauges are going to be required of a certain, a standard. So as long as we start having that, EMORs are going to be required through the permit. So it'll take a while. A permit cycle's 5 years. So in 5-6 years, hopefully we'll be in a pretty good spot. The question is, if I were king of the regulatory universe, how would I fix all these inconsistencies? And the way I would fix it is on these people that have these MORs, what they're reporting that's suspicious, send our field office people out after a rainfall event and nail them. I mean, that's where we've got to start. We've got to be able to do it. And this one town in Middle Tennessee that's an offender. We did that. We sent our field office person up there, and what they found compared to what they were reporting was a big difference. But the problem is, politically, then you get into this thing of, well, the mayor knows the state senator who's on the, environmental committee and all this kind of stuff. So that always gets into the mix. So if I could be the king and get the politics out of it, we could get a lot of way. If we could get the politics out of it, the people that we have in there now, we could get these things done. The politicians are killing this thing. You got a mayor, who, hell, I'm not going to name the names, but the mayor is trying to get taps, jockeying with us and the taps and using the senator, and he's the biggest developer in the town. He's got, sure, he wants all these taps. So, I mean, don't get me going on that. Those are kind of things you can't fix. I guess you can talk about them, so I'm at the point, I can talk about it. I mean, if I'm out the door tomorrow, that's not gonna make any difference.